Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar on leading your team through a return. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this webinar with Zack and Mock from the Innovation Beehive, and I'll be handing over to them almost imminently. But just to say that today is a brilliant webinar focusing on the practical steps you can take and some practical tools you can use to prepare to start leading your team towards return. So Mock, actually, Zack, am I handing to you or am I handing to Mock first? Handing to Mock. Mock, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. So everyone, hello. It is great to be with you here this morning to talk to you about how you can lead your teams through to return. I hope you can all see me. I can't see myself on the screen, so I'm assuming that you can all see me, and you can also see my colleague Zack, who's there, who'll be working the slides this morning. So I'm Mock O'Keefe. I'm the founder of the Innovation Beehive. We founded 11 years ago to accelerate the potential of teams, individuals, leaders, and brands. Before I joined the dark side of consulting, I worked in industry and ran teams across the United Kingdom, Europe, and the USA. So if you move on to the next slide, Zack, then you'll be able to see the basis of which this workshop is focusing on today. You know, over the last couple of months, we've really been living in these incredibly turbulent and tumultuous times. And as leaders, the question we've had to ask ourselves is, what do you do when no one knows what to do? Well, actually, in the 18 months prior to the pandemic, we were already starting to think about disruptive times. Disruption with a capital D, as opposed to the small d disruption that we're living through at the moment. Capital D in terms of thinking about disruptions in markets, thinking about disruptions in industry and business models through the rise of AI, automation, machine learning, and how that will impact on leaders and organizations. And we've been conducting research with leaders over the past 18 months about how they have led through disrupted times previously, whether it was the last great economic crash or whether it is the impact of technology on their industry. So that is more relevant now than ever. And united with that, we've looked back to huge world impacting events such as the economic crash of 2008. We've looked at change theory. We've looked at what happened in SARS and Spanish flus. And we've been able to identify that there are 4 key stages that we'll go through. One, the to stabilize phase. So what is happening? What is going on? Moving staff into furlough. 2, sustain phase, which we're probably just coming out of now, but not exactly clear. We'll ask that in a moment. Sustain phase is, how do I keep my business operating? And we've been doing that working from home and remotely over the last couple of months. The 3rd stage, which we're probably mostly moving into now, which is planning for return and our teams returning back to work in whatever form or shape that might look like. Before the 4th stage, renew, which is about facing to the future, re-establishing goals and objectives. So I'm interested thinking about those 4 stages: stabilize, steadying the ship, understanding what is actually happening. 2, sustain, keeping the business going, working remotely and still serving customers if possible. 3, returning to work. Or 4, renew, facing forwards and setting new objectives. Which stage, if you'd like to use the chat box, which stage do you think that you are at now? So I'm just going to see if we can pull up the chat box here. And I'd be interested to hear if you are in the stabilize, sustain, return, or in fact you're in the renew phase. So do let me know, and we'll discuss that. So glorious is between 2 and 3, so between sustain and return. Great, thank you. Sarah, the same between stabilize and return. We've got Richard moving from sustain to return. Sarah, stabilize, sustain. Marco in sustain. So a broad mix there. With most of us moving out of stabilize and somewhere in the middle there of moving either through sustain and into return, or at the beginnings of return. And Claire Tinney says, I think most businesses are within 2, 3, or 4, or working within bits of each. And I know, Claire, you work as a finance director, so actually you'll have an understanding of how people are business modeling their cash flow and their potential projections of sales and income around where they sit in each of those phases. So thinking about how we can then take this roadmap, on the next stage, we'll start to think about the return to the next normal. So there will be new expectations of your customers and new expectations of your employees as a result of COVID-19. Their expectations and their requirements will have changed. And over the next few weeks, it's important to really try and listen to both your employees and your customers to understand what their expectations are, to best set you up to return to what we're calling the next normal. Because you won't return to one fixed state. You won't return to one fixed point. What you'll return to is waves of normality. It will require you to be much more adaptable and much more agile. Expectations, emotions, and responses will change as we emerge through return and as we move into renew. Customers' expectations and requirements will change over time. Your employees' expectations and requirements will change over time. So you'll move into the next normal phase, then the next normal phase, and the next normal phase. As you'll see on the next slide, the leader has a crucial role in understanding and helping drive this return. Your leadership is not actually tested in the good times. Your leadership is tested in turbulent and difficult times like this. The way you respond, the way you treat your suppliers, your customers, and your employees, and set all of those three stakeholders up for return will be your leadership legacy and will massively impact on the amount of trust and investment they will have to help you move through return into renew and to deliver on your company's expectations. And on the next stage, I talk about the Stockdale Paradox, and this duality of leadership is what you've had to hold as leaders over the coming months and will potentially, as you plan and move into the return phase, also have to hold dear. Now, James Stockdale was talked about in Jim Collins' great book, Good to Great. James Stockdale was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. And when he came out of the Vietnam War many years later, he was a decorated military veteran and actually stood for election as the Vice President of the United States. Now, he was asked, how did you cope and live through the most awful times in a Vietnam prisoner of war camp? And he said, my advice to anyone living through very difficult, very troubled times is you have to have faith that you'll prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. And at the same time, you must confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And as leaders in the business, you've had to hold that duality of leadership, that Stockdale paradox, that COVID-19 paradox in your leadership role at the moment. And as you move into return, you'll have to confront the brutal reality of what the shape of the business is in, what may have changed, and be honest with your team about that, but also inspire them and help them see that there is potentially a future beyond COVID-19. And I believe, talking to a lot of our clients, this is a very exhausting place to be. It means that you are receiving new data sets continuously. You're having to hold the reality of now and move people also into the potential of the future. And that's incredibly demanding. And on the next slide, actually, we start to talk about some of the behaviors that might help you as you navigate return and as you navigate your way through this COVID-19 paradox. You will need to show absolute agility as you manage that paradox, because new data sets and new information will emerge continuously. You'll have to constantly update the decisions that you make based on these new data sets and based on information that you receive, the latest government guidance, the latest figures and trends in your customers' expectations. As an individual, not just as a leader, but as an individual, it is hard not to feel like a failure when you're having to constantly change your mind and constantly have to issue or go back and review decisions that you've made. But we think because we'll be moving into these phases of next normal, that's going to become the way we're simply going to have to operate. And as an innovation company, we've worked a lot with startups over the last couple of years, and Eric Ries coined the phrase, the lean startup. And taking his approach that he codified startups do, we believe actually as we're able to start to navigate our way through return, leaders need to demonstrate what we call start-up leadership. This is about building the best case decision based on the information that's in front of you at that particular time, getting that decision, implementing it very quickly, getting it out there and testing it with your stakeholders, seeing if it works, seeing if new information sets become available and you have to change your decision, and then iterating it the way startups innovate their product or service, rebuilding your decision and retesting it. This startup leadership will help you as an individual not feel like a failure and help you to really practice those skills of adaptability and agility that you will need to lead your people through return. Now, how do you make decisions as you navigate the detail of return? Well, the next slide takes its stimulus from the dogfighters in World War II. So those dogfighters, those that statistically, those fighters who practiced what was called the OODA loop, were statistically more likely to survive in battle. And there's some great stimulus in what they did that we can learn as we're making decisions and moving through planning and actually into the return phase. The first is, as you are presented with a new situation or a new piece of data, have a look at the data and just observe it and say, what has changed in this data since I saw it last time? Then orientate against it and understand, is this the most up-to-date data? And is there any unconscious bias or filter through which you are seeing this data that might impact on the best case decision that you can make? Once you're making a clean decision, aware of any unconscious bias or any filters on the latest, most up-to-date data, knowing how that data or information set has changed since you last reviewed the situation, you're then able to make the best decision at that particular time and then respond, move forward, implement and act upon your decision. Knowing by practicing lean startup that you may have to take the decision you've built, you may have to test it, it may need to iterate, you may need to learn new things and then go round the loop again to come up with the best decision with the data that you have available to you at the time. So thinking about that way of behaving, we're going to get into the detail now. In a moment, I'll hand over to my colleague, Zack. And we're going to be asking, so what will be your first step as you start to plan and move into the return phase? So Zack, I'm going to be quiet for a bit and hand over to you.
Well, only just for a bit, Mark. I might call you back a bit later on. So, hello, I'm Zack Curtis. I'm Capability Director with the Innovation Beehive. And what that means is that I have to make everyone capable to return to work post-COVID. And that's going to mean utilizing and leveraging a number of things which you will have come across before, existing bits of information, and probably some new bits of information as well. So this is our opportunity to take a step back from what we think we know, because we can't use that old thinking to move forwards in an effective way. So I guess the next logical first step would be for you all to take a look around the environment that you're watching this webinar in right now and see if you can see a pen. Now, if you can see a pen, grab the pen. If you have a piece of paper, grab that as well, because I have to admit that whilst I do have Mock and Joe to keep me company on webinars like this, it does get a bit lonely. So I'm going to ask for your interaction on the chat and in other methods like polls and things. So, so hopefully you'll join me on that journey as we move forwards now. So if you've got a pen, that's brilliant, because right now the logical step is to answer this question. What is half of 13? Now, if you could just write that answer down, that would be fantastic. Don't share it with anybody. It's your little secret for now. All you need to do is just answer this question. I don't know how long you might need. 10 minutes may be too long. You may have finished already. So let's move on whilst you complete answering that question. What is half of 13? Now, when we start thinking about how we can possibly help us and our teams move to returning to the business in the next normal, it's really important that we actually know ourselves first. How can we begin to actually support others and bring them back if we don't understand what it is that we do and how we will operate in this next normal? Now, there is one big challenge, of course, and that is that all of us are different from each other. And that, of course, is a great thing. I'm sure that you can think of somebody in your own life, doesn't have to be In the business world, it could be a friend, partner, child, family member, colleague, and so on, who actually approaches the world from a different point of view, who actually comes at problems totally differently from the way that you do. I mean, just think about how that manifests itself in your day-to-day work. What communication challenges does that bring up? We could have the argument right now around whether that comes from nature or nurture. There's arguments on both sides, but actually for the purpose of returning to work from COVID, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is, of course, this question. Lots of you will have written down, take a look at what you wrote down. Lots of you will have written down this number here, right? But having said that, not all of you did. Some of you will have answered the question in a different way, or maybe a multitude of different ways, like this. Some of you may have said, well, half of 13, I'm sure Zach's being a bit clever. He probably meant 1 or possibly 3, splitting the number vertically in half. Or perhaps it was splitting the number horizontally in half, written down, or written down as a number. Perhaps he means half unlucky, or half lucky, or half a baker's dozen, or half of 13 is just 50%. Of course, the real point and purpose is that these are answers that we've actually collected from the last 12 months of our face-to-face sessions when we asked this question. So even if you did answer 6.5, or even if you did answer half a baker's dozen, or even if you did answer it's 7 minus half, everyone will answer and approach that particular question from a different perspective. And all of those questions based on all of those answers based on the question I asked are correct. So our approach might be different. It's understanding others' approach, which is going to make the difference in aligning ourselves in returning effectively. Why? Well, we could make a supposition that it's because of the brain. Now, what do we know about the brain? We know that the brain is unique. All of our brains are different from each other. They are specialized, meaning they have different parts of the brain which are specialized in different functions. We know that the brain is situational, meaning that it will react to environmental stimuluses in different ways. We know that those different specialized parts are interconnected. We know that those different specialized parts have dominance, meaning in some people, certain parts of the brain will be more dominant than in others, which according to people like Roger Sperry in 1973, says that that's why a lot of our thinking is different. Of course, there are other reasons as well. We also know that the brain is malleable, meaning that old dogs can learn new tricks. It is possible to continue to reshape your brain. And we also know that the brain works as a whole. Essentially, it's the source of who we are, what we do, and how we do it. Now, I've noticed that whilst I'm talking, thanks, I've just noticed Gloria put Thur. Very good, Gloria, not for putting 6.5. Not that 6.5 was wrong, it was of course correct as well as Thur. I'm feeling a bit lonely, so it's probably about time we did something fun for us. And that is something fairly straightforward. Most of you have heard of the left brain, right brain theory. This is just to slide us into thinking about our different teams. And then if you start to think about yourself and whether or not you have a dominance, Roger Sperry, again in 73, built out the left brain, right brain model where he said that the brain was split into 2 halves. It's more complicated than that, but he said it was split into 2 halves and people have a dominance, either left or right. It's very rare to have a balance. And the left brain controls the right-hand side of the body. The left brain deals with facts, numbers, details, logic, process. The right-hand side of the brain controls the left-hand side of the body and deals with creativity, spirituality, emotion, seeing the big picture, intuition, and so on. And if we do presuppose that we do have a preference or a brain dominance, it'd be really interesting to see where your dominance lies. And I think we've got a poll, Joe, to ask you a question. So on your screen now, you should have a poll which asks where your dominance lies, either left, right, or very rarely equally balanced. I should caveat that by saying, of course, everybody can use all parts of their brain. Just because you might feel that you are left brain dominant, it doesn't mean that suddenly your right brain is redundant and you could just discard it. You can use both, but you may well in your day-to-day life have a natural preference. So we'll just keep that going for perhaps another 15 seconds. We've got most people answered, a few left. If I just reflect on myself, it's a great frustration to both Mock and Joe and other people in the Innovation Beehive that I am extreme right brain dominant, very little left brain activity, which comes with its own challenges, which we'll run through a little bit later.
Oh yeah, but that old dog is learning new tricks.
I am. Although I should probably say that according to some of the science behind, you will never flip from one to the other naturally, but you can learn to flex it like an elastic band. Okay, so we are done here. Very good. So we're now sharing the poll results. You'll see that the majority of attendees, 56% on this call, believe they're right brain dominant, 31% left brain dominant, and 13% feel they are perfect in practically every way, with 13%, which is great. Now, I know what you're saying. Why does that matter? Why is it even important? Well, it's important to us because I'm sure that you can think of different situations that you've been in, different environments where you have been at odds with somebody who thinks differently from you. I'm sure that you can think of communication challenges that you've had where it's been a misinterpretation of expectation or a communication process which has led to problems. And actually, that miscommunication piece is one of the biggest reasons for a lot of projects, relationships, and other challenges falling by the wayside. So we used not just the left brain, right brain principle, but various other pieces of research to develop this thing called the Innovators Profile. We originally developed it over the course of a year to be the start of how we can innovate in a more effective way. How can we leverage all of the different areas of our brain in order to come up with better innovations? But actually, we quickly realized that it's a much bigger tool than that. It's a tool that can help teams work more effectively together on innovations, and it's a tool which can help teams work more effectively in communicating the return to work post-COVID. Now, this is something which we've tested with a wide range of businesses. A lot of businesses have taken it on board as part of their culture, which is gratifying, but it consists of 4 different quadrants. The first one is questioning, second one classifying, third interacting, and fourth experimenting. And they each have different functions linked to the physiology of the brain. So if you happen to have a dominance in questioning, you'll be more focused on facts, numbers, technical problem solving, and so on. If you have a dominance in classifying, you will have a natural alliance to planning, being process oriented, supporting others in administration, and other things. If you have a dominance in interacting, you will be much more aligned to caring for others, giving to charity, teamwork, teaching, and so on. If you have a dominance in the experimenting quadrant, you'll be more likely to want to have fun in a process and not probably follow a process, and to see the big picture and to be intuitive linked to concepts. We won't be going too much into that today, but we will be, just so you know, having another webinar coming up on it's on the 4th of June. So do keep an eye on our comms for that. That'll be a deep dive in how you can actually leverage the Innovators Profile with your different team members, so you can understand their preferences, and then you can all adapt, agree, and align on how you return. There is a bit more on adapting, agreeing, and aligning a little bit later on today. So if you do want to sign up for that, just scan that QR code with your phone now.
Sorry, I should just chip in at that point, Zach, and say that QR code is actually going to enable people to fulfill their own Innovators Profile.
We're giving it to them?
Yes, I am. So if you scan that QR code with the camera on your phone, it'll take you to the Innovators Profile sign-up page, and it's completely free to complete. And that'll give you your own report, which will tell you where your dominance lies in those 4 quadrants that Zach just talked about. And I'll be sending a registration link to the webinar that Zach was talking about in a follow-up email to this webinar.
Joe, I can already see that you operate in the world slightly differently from me.
I'm on the left.
Good. So hopefully you've taken a scan of that to complete it. It leads through to a survey, which it's less than 3 or 4 minutes to complete. You will then receive a PDF report, about a 9-page PDF report, in the on the email address that you supply. Okay, very good. Let's just think about those differences then, because let's say that you understand your own profile, you understand the way that you approach the world. You start to think about how that might manifest itself in the way that you are heard by others. Well, let's think about recognizing others. We know that if we look at a bag of jelly beans, like you see on the screen here, even if you find two of the same color, they're almost certainly not the same shape exactly. How can you therefore try to manage the expectations, desires, motivation of your team in the same way if you use the same approach with everybody? We need to understand that our teams, especially in these COVID times, have experienced so much, regardless of whether they've been furloughed or tried to keep the business alive or running a business or anything else. They've all had their own challenges, and that means they're all going to need to be approached slightly differently. If you're going too factual and dominant for one, that will alienate another. It's something we absolutely need to understand and engage. We do have tools available to help with that as well, linked to their Innovators Profile, which Joe will talk about a little bit later on. There's another thing we need to bear in mind, and that is if we're looking at how a team operates effectively of and within itself in the past, there are clear characteristics in any leadership or management program you might have gone to in the past about teams having a clear goal, a results-driven structure, competent trained members of staff, unified commitments moving forwards, a collaborative climate, and support and recognition. And even in pre-COVID times, it was difficult to get all those things right, especially recognition and support, extraordinarily difficult. But of course, it's all changed now. How can we get our team unified in a collaborative climate when some of them may be working from home or some of them may be returning from being furloughed? They've all got different expectations, plus they've all got different thinking preferences in their profile. Well, there's one clear solution, and that is a great sense of communication from you, the manager or leader, combined with them understanding communication. So you meet and agree and contract somewhere in the middle. Of course, there are always different challenges to that. There are barriers to communication. Now, don't worry, I'm starting to feel lonely again. I'm going to get your input in just a minute. Whilst I'm talking, you might want to locate the chat function so you can be prepared to type something in when I ask. These barriers to communication pre-COVID would have been a whole range of things that we would have thought about before. It could be, culture, or even the mood that somebody's in, or it could be their preconceived perceptions or biases. It could be sitting in a meeting room, someone has something going on in their private life and they're giving out terrible nonverbal messages, which then is a barrier in communication in itself between two people. It could be hearing difficulties over a call or a webinar. It could be ambiguity in the message, or it could be linked to their profile or thinking preference where something is too woolly, too fluffy, too light, or too detailed, conversely, for the listener to understand. It could be a lack of knowledge. It could be the precise wording of a communication, and so on. But post-COVID, when we return, it's these and more. We also need to think about primarily the safety of our returning teams. What processes can we put in place in order to make sure that communication is maximized? So because everyone understands what processes have been put in place, therefore they feel safer. We have clients who they have one-way systems on their floor plates. They have one in, one out systems on their loos. There could also be something around guilt and injustice being a barrier to communication moving forwards. For example, if it could be that someone has been furloughed and they've loved it, but it could be that someone has been furloughed and they feel guilty that they haven't contributed to the business in some way. Conversely, there could be someone that has been supporting the business while others have furloughed and felt some sort of injustice that their colleagues have got a free paid holiday, albeit to 80% for a lot of people. There could be a miscommunication in expectations moving forwards. There could be anxiety levels going through the roof. We're seeing about that anxiety issue and depression a lot on the news in the recent weeks. Linked to that, there could be something around mental well-being and also cohort working. We've all become used to using online webinars, Zoom, various other systems as well to collaborate together. But that's difficult for people, especially if there are companies that we work with, for example, that have split their teams into different cohorts to make it safer to work together. But fine, we have these barriers, but how do we get over them? Well, we'll come to that in just a minute. But in the chat box, I wonder if you might add anything. Do you think there are going to be any other barriers to communication which will stop our teams returning effectively, or which you think we may need to be aware of when we're communicating with our teams on return? So do feel free to just type in the chat function, and we'll have a look at them as they come through. I hope I've been quite comprehensive.
Actually, Zach, you know that whole point around safety?
Yeah.
It's a really important point in communication. I'll just mention it whilst people are starting to think through other barriers and completing them in the chat function. One is people will have this filter about, am I safe? And that might then knock on and lead to anxiety or impact on well-being. But also communicating about safety as well. So, you know, it will be important, as you say, if there are one-way flow systems around an office, or one in, one out to the loos, or, you know, please don't use this breakout area that we've all got used to for innovation activities. The tone of voice and the visualizing of those safety messages are important as well. So you don't increase people's anxiety, their blood pressure, their heart rate, and make them scared whilst trying to make them safe.
Absolutely, Mark. And we've actually had some, I completely agree. We've had some things through here. So from Gloria, behavior, how we interact. You know, we need some clarity on what are the rules around shaking. Do we shake hands? Do we hug? Do we just signal from a distance? Also clarity around, oh yes. So Claire says there'll be a lot of fear about particularly those who are living with or at risk of COVID, and they've had to change their usual behaviors. Okay, and to address this disruption in teams, from Angela, it might be helpful for leaders to appreciate their teams are returning in their reforming, storming phase, so need to realign themselves around a shared purpose. Yeah, there's almost certainly going to be a piece that'll have to be done around purpose, probably working together with teams, not dictating it to teams.
And actually on that issue of purpose, we'll be issuing a white paper in about 3 weeks' time on reviewing your purpose in the light of COVID-19, and offering another webinar on that as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that.
Marco's made an interesting point. Are we closer on a video call than we will be sat in a room with everyone 2 meters distance or staring through a plastic screen? It's a really interesting point. And also you'll find that those people who are more right brain dominant, it's not exclusive, but it's slightly biased that way, will want that face-to-face human contact more than just a screen. We've all got quite used to the screen now, I think, but it's still very lonely for a lot of people just sitting, talking to people through a screen. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out, something we need to be aware of. Some people don't want to come back until they're sure it's safe. I had an email this morning from a friend in a company who runs events, and they have a series of events. It's in the music industry, but they've cancelled all their 2021 events, and they're now pushing back to 2022. So already we're seeing people starting to push back 18 months, which is just amazing. What a decision for them to make. So Richard says a barrier could be the desire to continue with business as usual. Yes, there's going to be a lot of people that want to do that, and so some clear guidelines, clear rules and boundaries would really need to be talked about and agreed. Rebecca, well, they're all coming through. Rebecca said, linked to well-being and anxiety, personal and financial loss that people may be dealing with. Absolutely right. Everyone is struggling with financial challenges or personal challenges at the moment. And it's also understanding the different types of those and how it's impacted the different people. Gloria, trust. Yeah, trust is going to be, I was thinking when we were talking about hugs about 4 weeks ago, I think the hug will become the new sign of trust for a lot of people. It means you're willing to let them in closer than the 2 meter rule. Rebecca, the distraction of having other people about and talking. Yeah, so many people have been, depending on your home situation, so many people have been used to working uninterrupted, or conversely, having to look after children as well as trying to do some work. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how we get through guidelines of the new working. Okay, very good. That does mean that with barriers to communication, and as we try to work through them, we do need to work out what our priorities might be. One of the reasons for that is with an understanding of ourselves and an understanding of our team and how our team approaches working through tasks. To get over all these barriers and to work through them, we need to be able to work efficiently and in a much more organized way than even the most organized people have in the past. So I've been thinking about priorities, and when I think about it, I try to think of what a definition might be. We define prioritizing as the habit of doing what we should do, when we should do it, whether we want to or not, for the benefit and success of our priority business goals. Now, there are loads and loads of tools to help us prioritize, which some are old hat and some are new. I'd love to understand first, though, on why you think, in the chat function, why you think prioritizing might be important. So if you have the opportunity and want to share why you think prioritizing when we return from COVID is important, that would be awesome. And while you're doing that, we'll debrief afterwards. But Mark, I wonder if you might talk about priorities linked to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we're thinking about prioritizing and making sure that we get all the things that we need to do done, it's helpful to think of it in two buckets, because you will have so many things on your notepad or your iPad, all of the things that you need to do, and you'll keep adding to it. You could become overwhelmed, and actually overwhelming means that you'll become frozen and won't know which to do first and which will have the most impact. So helpful, I think, is to think of it in two buckets. One, the practical, tactical things you need to do, like how does the flow work in the office, what is the physical density of your desk, etc. And the cultural piece, which is around how, as Zack's been talking about, how do you talk to your team, how do you contract your team about ways of working, what concerns might they have, how do you start to realign your team around your purpose, how do you get your team to really empathize and understand what's been going on in your customers' world. So when you've listed all the things that you need to do, sit them under two buckets, practical and cultural. I'm not saying they need to be equally balanced, but there needs to be quite a few things under cultural as well, not just the practical things about releasing people from furlough and payroll. It's actually releasing people's potential and energy to accelerate the potential and to deliver post-COVID-19. So Zack, what's been coming in on the chat?
Well, actually, it can be summed up in just one of the comments here. And that is simply because there will be so many old and new conflicting pressures. It's just not going to be possible to do them all. So we need to prioritize the right things at the right time. We do have one thing to mention just now that's literally just come in, is that companies are already starting to look at things like traffic light systems with regards to physical contact. And this person who sent it in, Yeshim, thank you very much. She can't wait to hug everyone, but knows that it's not going to be right because some people won't be expecting it. And they won't be comfortable with it. So there's going to just putting in structures in place to help with that. So that's very useful. Okay, so on priorities, there's going to be a point now where some of you will roll your eyes a little bit, and some of you will sit back slightly in your chair. Before you do that, I want to make something totally clear to you, and that is Dwight Eisenhower. So as all of you know, he was president of the United States from 1953 to 1961. I'm sure that was rolling off your tongue there. And there's a particular prioritizing tool which is attributed to him, but there's a more or less identical version which is also attributed to either Stephen Covey or Brian Tracy, depending on which you saw first. And that is, of course, the 4Ds. So before you roll your eyes, and before you say, yes, I've seen this one before, there's a couple of points I need to make. The first one is, if you haven't seen this tool before, it's a fairly simple matrix system for looking at the big stuff. So it's really for looking at the themes, but also you can use it with specific tasks on where you place your priorities. Now, your priorities should always be linked to the success of your business goals. And then you essentially write them onto this matrix. And of course, the Innovation Beehive, in order to make people capable, we have a template to help with that. But if you find that a task or a theme is important and urgent, you put it in the top left box there, do it now. If you find it's important but not urgent, you are able to delay it, you're able to schedule it in some way. If you feel that a task is not important but also urgent, there may be a way you can delegate it. If you feel that a task is not important and not urgent, then you should dump it, get rid of it, throw it away. Now, this is a fairly simplistic tool, but it has been around for many, many years. There's a reason why it's been around for many, many years. The first thing is it's easy to use. You should spend all your time, if possible, in do it now. Sorry, that's the way you should not spend all your time. You should spend, because that's firefighting, you should spend all your time in Q2 there. That's the delay one where you can plan and schedule as much as possible. But where you absolutely need to not spend your time is, of course, this dump box, the one way it's a lot of stuff which is not linked to your priority business goals. There are much more refined tools you can use. We have one that we train in, that Joe will mention later on, which is very, very useful, and that's about how you prioritize specific tasks at different levels. But the point I want to make with this particular slide is even old tools can be very useful. Now, as an L&D professional, an HR professional, over the years, I've heard this one over and over again, and I've never really bought into it until about 5 years ago, when I actually started to use it. When I actually started to use it every day, the night before, to help plan my next day. And by doing that, by using it consistently, it became more of a habit for me. When it became a habit, it started to become effective. So my strong urge to you all is whatever you think about this tool or other similar tools that you might have come across in the past, revisit them with an open mind, practice, drill, and rehearse them until they become a part of you. Make the tool work for you. It's only that way that you'll start to make a change. But for my own peace of mind, the psychologist in me would love to understand what you feel about why sometimes, not necessarily this tool, but sometimes it's difficult to embed the use of a tool for the benefit of us and our teams. And I think, Joe, we have a poll. So what stops us implementing any tools that we might come across and turning them into a habit? First option is, you should see this on your screen now. First option is my focus just goes. It goes on to something else. Second option is I just lose interest in the tool. That might be you feel it's a bit gimmicky, or you might be that it's difficult, find it's difficult to put it in as part of a habit. Other people might find they can't give the tool enough prolonged use to make it a habit. Other people say they might sound interesting, but not enough to motivate me to change. Or it could be something else. And if it's something else, do put it into the chat box.
We're almost there. We've got 68% of our delegates have voted so far. There are two clear winners emerging. I won't comment on what they are at the moment, but we'll just give maybe another 15 seconds for those who are a little bit shyer to respond. Now, I actually use the Eisenhower matrix quite a lot myself. I find it incredibly useful. And it just allows me, especially when I'm being pulled in by lots and lots of different people, and they're asking for time in my day or time in my diary, or asking me to commit to something. I find it a really useful way to say, is this action or something I'm being asked to do, does it fit somewhere on this box? And depending where it fits on the box, I'm more likely to say yes or no. I found it incredibly helpful. I've used it for a number of years. So we've had a decent amount of people have responded. So why don't we share the results? Zack.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so I can't give the tool enough prolonged use to make it a habit. So that is the clear winner, with my focus going on to something else. Those two are, of course, linked in some way as well. As the focus going on to something else, which means you probably can't take enough prolonged use to make it. So thank you very much for that. And that actually comes back to the point I was trying to make about this tool. Previously, I've dismissed it, but in the last 5 years, just like Mock, I have found that it's become useful because I've made the tool work for me. So this is something we promote now. Please, whatever you think of it, do try to make this tool or any other tool that you use a habit until it becomes something which is part of the way you operate. And you'll find that your day-to-day working life becomes more prioritized, becomes easier just from that prolonged use and making it part of the way you behave. I've got some tips as well for you, which are coming up. The first one is, when you get those priority tasks, the ones you really need to focus on, just do it now. I was working with one of the world's leading horse trainers in the States recently, and her motto for everything is do it now, do it now. And just from that one phrase, I've been able to progress so much in my day-to-day life. Do persevere, linked to that chat, the poll results earlier. Do persevere with everything you possibly can. Try to avoid any distractions. Try to put yourself in a place of work which means that you can work uninterrupted. Do tick off actions as you go. It's quite satisfying, and then that leads to you being more motivated. Do absolutely trust the process of the tool that you're using. And then, how do you eat an elephant? We know that phrase, where you break it into smaller chunks. Slice by slice is the way you eat an elephant. So break large chunks into smaller chunks, and do be realistic with time. If you set yourself a goal which is unachievable, you're not going to be motivated to complete it. And then the strongest, most important prioritization tip that I can give you is plan tomorrow today. Absolutely, tonight, plan your tasks tomorrow. Make your priorities. And that does two things. Firstly, it means that you will be able to passively incubate the challenges you're facing overnight. Your brain will work on it overnight, which means tomorrow, a quarter of the job is already done because your brain has already started working through it. It also gives you a sense of purpose in the way that you work through those tasks in the morning, because you're not reacting as much. So those are things I definitely recommend doing. And it's probably you've heard enough of my voice now. So Mark, we should probably let you have a run.
Hello, I'm back. So I'm thinking about how you can support your teams through into the next normal. I think the first thing I want us to quickly talk about is the employee journey. It's about taking a holistic view of return and focusing on each of the touch points in your employees' experience as they begin to return, both from a very functional perspective in terms of what needs to happen here, and an emotional perspective, thinking about what concerns might they have, how might I reassure them, and how might I give them a space that they're able to discuss that with me and move through. So breaking down each touch point on your employee's life cycle as they begin to prepare to return to work and as they actually prepare to work, thinking about their concerns and the practicality. And by touch points, I mean things like their commutes to work, your first team meeting with them. You might have a team meeting where some people are at work. You might have a team meeting where some people are working from home. What's the employee experience for those different cohorts? You may have a team meeting happening on a Wednesday, and you may not have some of your team working until Tuesday. How do you make sure that you replicate the experience of that team meeting on Monday, again on Tuesday? What's your first one-to-one look like when you're trying to social distance with somebody and you're not sitting down having a cup of coffee in the coffee shop you normally do have the one-to-one in? So breaking down all of those distinct interactions that you will have with your team, thinking of their employee journey the way you might think of a customer journey, allows you to be much more intentional as a leader as you start to plan and actually implement the return, and think really clearly about the kind of outcome and experience you want to create for your employee.
And when we do that, it's really important that we also link it back to what we know about recognizing our team's preferences, the way that they think differently from us. The sigmoid curve is a standard S-curve, either a repeating S-curve or a standalone S-curve, where each of our employees, each of our team members will be going through a different emotional state, different from each other. So in each of those employee touch points, we need to be aware of that in the way that we approach them. So for some people, they'll be on a decline for whatever reason it might be, before they reach a point where they will learn and then grow and then decline again. It just seems to be the natural human state. But do be aware that each of them will be at a different point. So you need to recognize those differences in the team to engage them in every single touch point, every single point of their employee's journey. So that's fine to say. The important thing is to remember it's yourself first. You've got to absolutely make sure that you are operating on all cylinders. You understand yourself, how you communicate and how you're going to return yourself to the next normal. before you can teach your team to do things like prioritizing effectively. Remember that they are all different. They all have different approaches, and that you need to engage them all slightly differently. And essentially, you do need to care for your team's priorities as well. There's going to be a period of time where we have to hand over to them and almost handhold with them for a while until the next normal becomes the normal.
I think actually, just to add to that, Zach, I think we're going to be asking people to really shift up a gear. So whether you've been furloughed at the moment, you're dealing with homeschooling or watching Netflix and baking cookies or whatever you might be doing, you're not necessarily in work mode. And it's going to be unrealistic for leaders to expect someone to come back on the 1st of July, have their first team meeting, be handed a project and go with it. So people will have to move from sort of almost neutral up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And leaders should be aware there will be a mountain for people to climb. And also supporting that those team members who are not furloughed, who are holding and keeping the wheels on the business at the moment. We're talking to clients who are talking about doing 10, 12-hour days, working 6 days a week, sometimes feeling the pressure to be on 24/7. Once they go back to work, there isn't a pause for them. So they've got to make sure that you refill those team members' tanks who haven't been furloughed. So they're able to climb the mountain alongside the colleagues who are returning from furlough.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that does lead on to how, different ways that we can support people. And even if I think about people who are just not used to work or haven't previously worked from home, but now they have to, there are different methodologies that you can use to help them with that, getting them to think about the time they use, how do they plan their time, particularly if they have challenges on space or challenges with family at home with demands and so on, and what sort of routines do they need in order to get best practice in discipline and prioritizing. And then also having clear goals which work for them, which then you can encourage them to set the night before, for example, so that they are effective in those times. It's possible that they can get more done in a shorter period of time if they have the right intention from the start, and also supporting them with advice on what could be the right environment for them to work in. Some people actually have learned that by moving around the house, different parts for different times, that it works really well for them.
Can I just say, actually, that whole thing about not judging where someone's environment is, I had a call with a client yesterday, and they were holding the conference call with me in their garden. And pre-COVID-19, I might honestly have had a perception, gosh, they're in the garden, they look very relaxed, are they really working? Now I just accepted the fact they needed somewhere to go and work that worked for them. And hey, they were in the garden. So I think our natural filter of they're in the garden, they're not working, we'll have to be conscious of that and make sure we can see beyond it.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Mock. And there's another element which for a lot of managers and leaders will be new in terms of their own teams. We're used to conducting one-to-ones, perhaps with team members, but there's going to be an element where we need to proactively coach them, developmental coaching. Now, probably the most well-known model for this is Sir John Whitmore's GROW model for coaching. Sir John Whitmore was a racing driver. He actually went to the agricultural college. So I know there's some people on here from the agricultural university there. He went to the ag college back in I think it was the 50s. And he developed, when he stopped being a racing driver, this model called the GROW model for coaching. He became quite successful bringing sports concepts, one of the pioneers of it, into the business world. And it's a 4-step process where when you help your team to develop, firstly, you're clear with them and you agree on what goals, what you have, what you want to actually achieve. And then there's some insight work into what actually is happening now, what do you know, understanding the landscape so you can navigate your way through it effectively and work out what your options are, the best route through that landscape to achieve your goal, and then you can plan a clear way forward. So that particular model is a very useful one because it's straightforward and it does seem to make a lot of sense. And some tips around it are, it's not about you as the leader telling people what to do. It's absolutely about you using questions to prompt discussion. If you say it and you tell someone the information, they're less likely to buy it. But if I say it, if you're coaching me, then I'm probably going to believe it because I said it. So it's about using questions to prompt discussion so that you can reach an agreement on the progress you're making through the GROW sequence, which by the way is cyclic, not linear. And then you can check for understanding very clearly as you go along because you've both reached an agreement. And that's about that expectation piece with the communication that you have because you recognize that they think differently from you. Giving praise when they do something successful is extraordinarily important to keep their motivation. Looking for good points to reinforce in what they've done. It might not be something that they actually recognize immediately, but you've picked up on it. Clarifying clear next steps for them in each coaching session that you might have, and also expressing eagerness for you to work with them. If they think you're invested in the process as well, they're very likely to buy into it even more deeply and be motivated by it. It doesn't mean that you need to be an expert on things like giving feedback. Now, there may be a number of models that you're used to, the sandwich technique or the flow model, various other models of giving feedback, and work with whatever works for you. We, of course, have some preferred methods at the Innovation Beehive, but I wanted to give you just a couple of clear tips beyond the models themselves. One is, do you give feedback in public or private? Actually, there's a case for both. For most, it's going to be private, but if it's something really amazing, some positive feedback, you might well want to do it in public, depending on your understanding of the profile of the person you're giving feedback to. Be clear about the purpose of the feedback as well. Emphasize the positive part, even when you're trying to give negative feedback. People are going to open themselves up to the negative feedback, and I'm using that word deliberately, if you open them up with something positive first. Avoid being too general in your feedback. Give specific examples where you can, and verbatim where possible. And do focus on behavior more than anything else. Try to be descriptive as possible, and try not to have any judgmental language in there at all, because that will instantly get people's hackles up. And we need to ensure that we own the feedback. Now, what we mean by that is, ideally, it should be something that you've seen before and you want the person to change. If it's third-party information, then it becomes quite difficult with you being the middleman. Do offer suggestions, not advice. That way the person can buy into the solution, and do allow them an opportunity to respond. And your goal is not to fight back on their response, but to accept it and then redirect it. Summarize and support. Mark, probably wish to hear from you again.
Hello again. So as you start to think then about how your team will work together using some of the tools that Zack has described over the course of this webinar, I think it's important to actually agree with your teams where you are currently and agree ways of working. So we've been talking to clients who are going out, having discussions one-on-one, the leader and their team members, about how do you think you would like to work going forward? What behaviors do we need to demonstrate together to enable us to shift up our gears from neutral 3 to 5? What actually hours of working work for you? What days of working work for you? What does the schedule look like? And what sort of challenges and problems might we all have to collectively overcome over the next few months as we return to work? Contracting as a team, one-on-one with individuals, and then typing that up, sharing it with the team in an online meeting, means that you're starting to focus and prioritize on the cultural aspects of bringing your team back together. Bringing them back together and putting some glue and your culture together so that they understand how they can best work together, and you have a shared understanding of a way forward. So hopefully on the next slide here, you'll see just a summary of some of the things that we've covered today. When you're thinking about return, whether it's planning for return or actually you're in return now, consider both the practical and the cultural elements of return when you're planning and when you're prioritizing. Think about how you are communicating to your team members, your natural preference, and then their natural preference on how they wish to receive information. Understand their expectations, what's going on in their life at the moment, what might have changed as a result of COVID-19, and how what you did previously will not happen in the next normal, and in the phase after that, and in the phase after that. It's about agreeing a way together that works for you, contracting the best way to work together, and then supporting it with some of the tools that Zack shared about ongoing coaching and support. So I'm going to hand back to Joe now, who's going to give you a little bit more information about where you can find out more.
Thank you, Zack. Yeah, thanks, Zack. As well as this webinar, we have created a virtual toolkit for leaders as you plan to return. And not only is it a toolkit, but it also has more in-depth guidance on how to use all of the tools that you've seen on this webinar and many, many more. Zach, if you want to just start that video on the screen there, we'll be able to get a flavour of what the course looks like and just how much content we're talking about. We're talking about understanding ourselves, understanding others, thinking about decision-making, communication, prioritisation, collaboration, coaching, teamworking, leading remotely, everything that we've talked about today and so much more. And all of the tools that we've shared with you today are in that virtual toolkit and on that course. There's videos explaining how to use them in more detail. So everything you need is there. And as a thank you for attending this webinar and to support you through this, Zach, if you can move to the next slide, we have a discount code. So all you need to do, again, I'm a big fan of these QR codes since I discovered that you can scan them with a camera on your phone as opposed to having to download an app. You can scan that QR code and be sure to use welcome return 50 as the coupon code when you go to checkout. And that course is there, it's available. It's great for leaders of teams, it's great for leaders of businesses. Do access it and make the most of all those tools and resources. The cover price, as you'll see, is £99, but with that 50% discount, you'll be able to access it for just £49.50. So do take a look at that, look at the content. If you have any questions at all, please do reach out to me on joe@innovationbeehive.com and I'll be able to let you know anything you need to know about that course. So I'll be sending the link by email after this webinar as well. And just to say thank you, Zach, if you want to move to the next slide. Just to say a huge thank you to Mark and to Zach for leading the webinar today. And thank you to all of you for contributing so wonderfully to the conversations and to the polls. It's been a pleasure to spend the day with you, to spend the morning with you, and look forward to seeing you on the virtual Leading Your Team to Return course. So Zach, maybe move back to the last slide so that people can scan that QR code if they weren't able to already. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Take care, everyone. Be safe and be strong.